I call to the February 14th, Happy Valentine's Day, Planning Commission meeting to order at 6 o'clock. Call for a roll call.
Chair Andrew Carr.
Here.
Nicole Hendricks. Ron Heiberling.
Here.
Matt Constantine.
Here.
Sam Skall. Yana Semenova.
Here.
Jennifer Willard.
Here.
Thank you.
And pledge allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Citizens input. This is a time that citizens have the opportunity to address the Planning Commission regarding any item that is not already scheduled for a formal public hearing tonight. Therefore, if any member of the audience, either here in City Hall or via Zoom, would like to speak about any work session item or any other matter of concern, please raise your hand or send a message to the recorder using a Zoom chat function so that we may hear from you now.
I currently have no attendees on Zoom.
No attendees. Very good. If you do wish to testify, you will need to fill out a testimony card that states your name and address and provide that with our recorder. We have first on the agenda is the administrative matters consideration of the January 10th, 2024 minutes that were previously distributed. Are there any corrections to the minutes? I am seeing everybody nodding their head, shaking their heads. Hearing no corrections, the minutes are approved as distributed. Next agenda item. This particular one is a public hearing. Matters before the Planning Commission involve legislative public hearings. These are somewhat different than the quasi-judicial hearings conducted by the city's Development Review Board. The Planning Commission would like to hear from anyone who has testimony to offer that is relevant to the issues before the Planning Commission. If you wish to testify tonight, you need to complete a testimony card. For those who are in person, please complete a testimony card located at the side of the room and hand it to the recorder. For members of the public participating remotely with the Zoom meeting platform, digital testimony cards are already filed with the recorder, but we ask that you please indicate now or after the presentation a desire to testify by sending a message to the recorder at City Hall using the Zoom chat function. For those people joining the meeting by phone only, you will be unmuted after the staff presentation and asked one at a time if you wish to testify. If you have not previously submitted a digital testimony card, please request one now using the Zoom chat function. Please note that testimony may also be submitted by email during the hearing by emailing the following email address: planning@ci.wilsonville.or.us. Then please confirm with the recorder through the Zoom chat option that you emailed your comments. Your email will then be read into the record. Remain in the meeting until your comments are received and read aloud. Written comment and testimony received after the public hearing has closed cannot be considered. Because your testimony gives you legal standing in the matter for which you are testifying, it is important that you provide your full name and address at the beginning of your comments. Or, if you prefer not to state your address aloud in the public forum, state your address is as provided on the testimony card you submitted and make your statement. When your name is called to testify, if you are present in council chambers, please come forward to the podium and speak clearly into the microphone for the record. If you are participating in the meeting remotely using the Zoom phone or web platform, please wait to be unmuted by the recorder before stating your name and comments for the record. When you testify, Please address your comments to the findings category or criteria outlined in the staff report and applicable regulations that city staff cite at the start of the hearing. Some of the issues that come before the Planning Commission are fairly complicated. For that reason, we especially appreciate any specific recommendations or suggestions that you may have. We will ask you to avoid redundant testimony. If you agree with testimony that has already been given, just tell us that. If we have a large number of people interested in testifying, we may limit the time allotted to each member of the public to 3 minutes. At the end of your testimony, members of the commission may have questions for you. Thank you for taking the time to participate in the hearing tonight and help us to deal with these issues. So resolution number LP 24-0001, a resolution of the City of Wilsonville Planning Commission recommending the Wilsonville City Council amend the text of the Development Code to make minor modifications to the Coffee Creek Industrial Design Overlay District standards. And the public hearing is open at this time, and the time is 6:06 p.m. Staff? Oh, there she is. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, let's see here. So good evening, Chair Carr and Commissioners. My name is Cindy Luxhoy, Associate Planner. And at tonight's meeting, I am presenting for the Commission's consideration proposed development code amendments to the Coffee Creek Industrial Design Overlay District. The purpose of the amendments is to more closely align the standards of Section 4.134 with current and future needs of prospective industrial users, while not compromising the city's ability to continue creating a connected, high-quality employment center in Coffee Creek. The timeline on this slide summarizes the steps in the Coffee Creek assessment project. Staff initiated this work in early 2023. The work concludes with tonight's public hearing and recommendation to City Council, followed by the City Council adoption hearing on March 4th and subsequent integration of the amendments into the Development Code. The form-based code standards affected by the proposed code amendments are listed on this slide and included in Attachment 1 of the Planning Commission staff report. I'll briefly provide some more detail about the proposed amendments on subsequent slides. The first proposed amendment allows 2 parcel driveway width maximums. It keeps the current maximum width of 24 feet for the primary driveway, providing access for passenger vehicles and light-duty trucks, and adds a maximum width of 40 feet for a secondary driveway that provides access for larger delivery vehicles and trucks. This minor modification balances the main goal of limiting pedestrian crossing distance to provide better pedestrian connectivity at the primary driveway, with the need for a safe turning radius for larger vehicles at a secondary driveway to prevent traffic slowdowns, stacking on the street, and damage to curbs and landscape areas from turning trucks. The second proposed amendment continues to require a minimum 8-foot width for pedestrian connections between the primary street frontage and primary building entrance or entrances, but other pathways into a site may be narrower, provided they meet all other accessibility requirements. This modification acknowledges that it is overly burdensome to require all connections from a street to be 8 feet wide, and gives highest priority, as intended by the standard, to connecting the primary street frontage to the primary building entrance or entrances. The next proposed amendment continues to limit the maximum parking on the primary building frontage to 16 spaces, but removes the requirement that the spaces be located within one double-loaded bay of parking. The amendment also requires 50% of allowed spaces to be designated for short-term visitor and disabled parking, thus allowing other spaces to be utilized for longer duration or by other users, such as employees. The modification still meets the intent of minimizing the appearance of parking from an addressing street, thus providing a human scale to the public realm while allowing flexibility in parking configuration and use. For retaining walls, the proposed amendment keeps the 48-inch maximum for walls visible from adjacent streets, but increases the height to 60 inches when a retaining wall is only visible to users from within a site. The modification emphasizes the intent to minimize site grading to preserve the natural character of a site and integrate retaining walls with other design features while providing some design flexibility by slightly increasing the allowed height of walls that aren't visible from the street. The proposed amendment for retaining walls also adds explanatory text to the standard for retaining wall design, stating that retaining walls longer than 50 linear feet must be tiered, and that the 5-foot minimum horizontal offset is between the lowest part and the upper part or parts of the wall. Adding this text to the standard for retaining wall design continues to achieve the intent while providing needed clarification for applicants. The next proposed amendment increases the allowance to 20% for the required canopy at the primary building entrance, thus permitting a minimum canopy height of 12 feet, while retaining the preferred minimum of 15 feet in the standard. This modification also adds a footnote to Table CC-4 at other standards, such as for ground floor height to allow corresponding reduction in the minimum height of these aspects of site design when an applicant elects to reduce the required canopy height. The modification acknowledges that a canopy height of 10 to 12 feet is the standard storefront dimension, where a height above 12 feet requires something like a curtain wall system, which may be more expensive and require custom fabrication. In addition, a lower canopy height may allow for better weather protection at the primary entrance and can facilitate interior-exterior integration and line of sight. Modifying the allowance provides design flexibility for applicants without changing the preference for a taller canopy height. With respect to base design, the proposed amendment clarifies that a distinctive appearance of the building base may be achieved using any one of 3 design options in the standard and does not require both a change in material, texture, color, or finish and a change in surface position. By allowing the applicant to choose any one of these 3 options, the modification acknowledges that having a base that is both visually and dimensionally distinct can be difficult to achieve, particularly with tilt-up concrete construction. And the same distinctive appearance is possible to create and can be equally effective using either design element. At tonight's public hearing, staff is seeking a Planning Commission recommendation to City Council to adopt the proposed Development Code amendments. The City Council adoption hearing and first reading of ordinance number 889 is scheduled for March 4th with second reading on March 18th. And that concludes my presentation for tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
For her.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I appreciate the approach, the iterative approach the city has taken to address new standards and how perhaps they're not perfectly aligned. So that's a fantastic approach to developing new standards. My only comment is on the resolution on the page 2. It talks about, it says, whereas none of the applications was processed. I think that should say were processed. But it's a grammatical comment. But other than that, I think it's fantastic. So thank you for the work.
Thank you.
I do also appreciate staff efforts.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's all I have. So all members of the public on the call will be unmuted if they wish to testify. If you wish to testify, please raise your hand or send a message to the recorder using the Zoom chat feature so that we may hear from you. If you email comments, please state for the record, and staff will read those comments into record. Do we have anybody on, or do we have any cards?
I currently have no attendees on Zoom.
And do we have any comment cards? Okay. Then I will declare the public hearing closed at 6:16. Now, do we need to, wait, committee discussion information? Point of clarification, do we make the motion then discuss?
You can have a general discussion ahead of the motion, but it seems like there's not much to discuss. So if you want to move straight to the motion, the motion will be made, seconded, and then you have discussion before the vote as well.
Made, second, and then discussion. Okay. All right. So, and I need to amend it. Do I need to amend the word?
So just whoever makes the motion can just make a note that they're moving to approve the resolution with the change to it's the fifth whereas clause on page 2 from was to were.
Say again, the fifth?
The fifth whereas clause on page 2 of the resolution.
Whereas.
I'll make the motion.
You'll make the motion, all right.
I move to approve Resolution LP 24-0001 with the adjustment on the fifth whereas clause on page 2 from was to where, or were.
I'll second the motion.
Excellent. Do we have any discussion on the motion before we vote? Nothing? No discussion? I will add, and so my comments are in regards to the amendment placed before us, is it is meeting 3 statewide planning goals. It covered the citizens' involvement, it was directed at land use planning, and it impacted the economic or impacts economic development. There's 4 goals for the Wilsonville comprehensive planning that we also touched on. Encouraging public involvement, interested, informed, involved citizenry, coordinate and other agencies and organizations, and then it is creating an attractive, functional, economically viable community. And this whole thing began with a work session September 13th of 2023. And with that, I think we vote. So do you want to restate the motion?
Either do a roll call vote or all in favor.
You want to restate the motion, and then I'll call for a vote?
You don't, we don't
need
need.
to?
No, and you can do it by voice vote. If there's confusion about how many people are voting yes versus no, then you can ask for a roll call vote as well. Whichever, it's your preference.
I don't know the choices. Just call one by one. Roll call vote, she would ask each of us?
Yes.
Or we just say yes? Yeah,
The roll call vote would be, each one of you would be either Paula or Mandy calling each person and getting your vote, or you can do it by voice vote.
Let's do roll call vote.
Commissioner Constantine,
Yes.
Commissioner Heberlein,
Yes.
Commissioner Willard,
Yes.
Commissioner Semenova,
Yes.
and Chair Carr.
Yes.
Passes unanimously.
All right. Next agenda item is the Stormwater Master Plan. This is a work session, so I think we need staff. Ask, can you show or receive? Yes.
Is it the top one?
Just 1 second while we get the presentation loaded. All right, good evening, Chair Carr and Planning Commission members. My name is Zach Weigel. I'm the city engineer for Wilsonville, and with me is Angela Weiland, sorry about that. We're here before you tonight to talk about the Stormwater Master Plan, the update project. We were last before you in October. Gosh, it feels like only a couple months ago, but and at that meeting, we talked a lot about what goes into a master plan and some of the regulatory requirements, the staff interviews that were done, the maintenance records, public feedback, the system modeling that's been done, and a lot of the stream assessment work, and how that all kind of goes into that master plan and how we identified the deficiencies in our stormwater system. So I know there's a few new faces on the Planning Commission since then, so Angela's going to talk a little bit, recap about that, but what we're mostly going to focus on tonight is the capital improvement program, which is the projects and programs to address those deficiencies in the system. So just a little bit about, if you want to go to the next slide. So just as a reminder, we did some public outreach at the beginning of the project. We did some public engagement on Let's Talk Wilsonville to get feedback on what are the problem areas, how's the city doing, managing the stormwater system, and really favorable responses, 97% favorable. So seems like the community thinks we're doing a good job of managing the system. We got a lot of great feedback on areas of concern throughout the community. So those areas are being addressed through the master plan. So with that, one other thing I wanted to mention, the master plan is really about projects and programs to mitigate deficiencies in the system and to try and plan for projects to serve future development areas. It's not a plan that really establishes policy, stormwater policy or requirements to meet regulatory needs. That's done through our stormwater management plan that goes through a full DEQ review, and they sign off on that. So just a little bit nuance that I wanted to mention before we jump into the stormwater master plan presentation. So I'll, Angela, if you want to take it up. Yep.
All right, thank you. Nice to see some of you again, and nice to meet some of you again. So like Zach mentioned, our stormwater master planning process started in early 2021. And we used that stakeholder input and open house kind of forum to solicit information from the public at the beginning of our project. We wanted to identify needs up front that would inform our ongoing data collection efforts, as well as the technical analyses that would go into it. So during that public survey process, we not only gauged, public input and feelings about the system and how the system is managed in the city, but also those problem areas that we wanted to make sure and address as we went through our effort. We conducted also staff interviews. We met with Public Works, we met with Community Development, we met with engineering staff to also gauge issues and concerns internally. We conducted a variety of site visits and identified problem areas that in turn folded out into the capital improvement program that we'll talk about in a little bit. Those problem areas informed the technical analyses, and that's what took a majority of the time in our project schedule. We conducted hydrologic and hydraulic modeling to identify capacity deficiencies. We conducted a stream assessment, a geomorphic stream assessment, where we walked certain reaches of the channel to identify issues and potential improvements. We also conducted water quality retrofits. We identified where additional water quality treatment would be beneficial, as well as where retrofit of an existing facility could enhance performance, both from the treatment and a flow control perspective. All of that information fed into a larger capital improvement program, where we identified projects, those citywide programs. So just to differentiate a little bit, projects are generally considered a one-time cost. A program would be something that would be annually budgeted for. We wanted to look a little bit at policies and just any challenges that may be in existence in current code that could be resolved down the road. And we did cost estimation both for those projects and programs. All of that information feeds into the document, the Stormwater Master Plan document that you have. And the end part of the process is looking at staffing implications to implement the projects and the programs that we've identified, prioritizing those projects, and in conjunction with prioritization, a recommended schedule for when we would recommend implementing each of those projects so that it can fit within budget limitations. Right now, we're in the kind of that last stage, which is stakeholder outreach and engagement. One of the unique features, I think, of this master planning process is that we had the opportunity to relate a lot of the technical activities with requirements under your NPDES municipal stormwater permit, as well as your TMDL, or total maximum daily load implementation plan drivers. So at the beginning, there was a lot of work done to review code, look at maintenance records, look at maintenance programs, and inform some of the technical deliverables associated with your MS4 permit and your stormwater management program document. But in conjunction with that, there were technical exercises that in turn informed the capital project list that we've developed, as well as those staffing analyses and financial rates. Some of the deliverables done to support those other regulatory programs directly fed into the recommendations we have here. So as mentioned earlier, that upfront project needs identification was resulted in 33 locations that we wanted to look at further. And that overall process is described in the master plan document. Again, those technical analyses, and I could go into a lot of detail about each one of those, and I'm not going to for tonight, but, ultimately resulted in 47 project opportunity locations that were vetted with city staff, discussed during workshop settings, and ultimately prioritized to inform the capital improvement program in the master plan. As you can see, not very well on this map, it's a little small, but those 47 project opportunity locations were categorized by objectives. Those objectives include capacity, maintenance, repair and replacement or system condition, areas where additional infrastructure is needed to address growth or existing challenges with drainage, water quality, and erosion and sediment control. Most project opportunities actually covered 2 or 3 of those objectives. During that workshop process, we did almost a preliminary prioritization. We looked at each of those different project opportunities, what the source of the issue was, whether or not it was an immediate need or maybe a longer term need. And all of those project opportunities were categorized and addressed either through a funded project as part of this master plan, via a program. Maybe this was an area where additional policy considerations could address it. And then a final list of any future unfunded projects. These were project opportunity areas where there wasn't maybe that immediate need, but we still wanted to keep it on record and make sure that that area could be looked at in the future. So the result of all that analysis, we came up with 15 individual capital projects. Those 15 capital projects relate to 20 individually costed project phases. Some of the projects were very large in scope, and so they were split into 2 different phases so that that cost can be distributed further out and scheduled accordingly. There were also 4 planning projects that are proposed, and these are also one-time projects, but for example, include a flow monitoring and rainfall gauge installation that would support additional hydrologic and hydraulic modeling of certain areas to make sure that we can really refine the sizing of those capital project needs. Those projects were in turn scheduled based on priority, and that more detailed prioritization process involved a number of city staff, both public works and community development engineering were reflected. And we looked at various criteria, weighting schemes, and scoring to help really refine that prioritization. That information was then used to inform the project scheduling. So we have project scheduling in terms of 5-year periods. So the near term is a 5-year period, midterm is the next 5-year period, with longer term funded project needs extending 10 years plus. Some of those more near-term projects may look a little familiar to you. They represent areas that have had ongoing discussions and concerns or additional or upfront planning that's already been conducted. That includes Day Road, Miley Road, the Ash Meadows flow mitigation site, as well as Beckman Creek stabilization areas. So as Zach mentioned, there were also a few program needs that were identified. And the list of programs, and these also reflect an annual cost or annual budget allocation. These include allocations to resolve localized drainage improvements. So these would be smaller drainage improvements that don't really warrant a large-scale project or even going out to a consultant or contractor to do. Installation of water quality retrofits on an opportunistic basis. Maintaining a citywide R&R program. So this is a repair and replacement, just recognizing that over time, pipe and structures are going to degrade, and there should be a more proactive process to engage your asset management system to proactively replace those. The one program I wanted to mention in particular is the Charbonneau R&R program. Has a pretty hefty price tag associated with it. But since 2014, the city's been implementing the Charbonneau Consolidated Improvement Program, which is a master plan specific to the Charbonneau area, looking at sanitary, water, and stormwater utilities and prioritizing those system replacements. So in order to continue that program over time, we needed to capture replacement of the remaining pipe in that Charbonneau area. And that's what that larger program cost is associated with. It accounts for the 12,000 linear feet of pipe that's already been replaced, as well as some of the individual capital projects that have already been costed out. But it reflects the remainder 30,000 linear feet of pipe replacement needed. Kind of at the tail end of our planning process, we wanted to look at staffing needs to support implementation of the master plan as a whole. To do that, we looked at both public works staffing levels as well as community development and engineering staffing levels. We looked at what activities were affiliated with implementation of the stormwater permit, that MS4 permit, and the maintenance, the routine maintenance that goes into that. We also looked at the new capital projects and the additional assets and the additional engineering staff time it would take to actually manage those projects. So through that effort, and that effort is reflected in the master plan document as well, we saw a need for approximately 2.7 public works staff, and that is primarily to address deferred maintenance and proactive maintenance required under the MS4 permit. Under community development and engineering, the gap was about 1.4 FTE, and that could be kind of staggered out over time, but really the bulk of that effort is to implement the capital projects that are listed. So in summary, the capital projects, which are also include the planning projects, program costs, and then the staffing levels, result in an overall capital improvement plan and a capital budget of approximately $60 million. So with that, I don't know, do you want to wrap this one?
Sure, I can,
Okay.
yeah, I can go ahead, yeah. So next steps on we're happy to answer questions that you may have. The next steps are really, we're meeting with, having another work session with City Council, and then we're planning for public hearings before Planning Commission on March 13th, and then following with City Council in April. So happy to answer any questions.
Anybody want to start, or do you want me to call on you?
Your choice.
All right, we'll start with Commissioner Constantine.
Thank you for all the work. I just had a couple comments. You mentioned that you identified what you called project opportunities, which is a great term, 47 project opportunities. How did you define those, or how did you identify those? You talked about talking to staff and the public, but a lot of people don't care about stormwater. They're probably not lining up to give you comments unless there's a failure somewhere. But just in general, how did you define that?
So as part of that upfront kind of survey effort, there were noted locations where you see a lot of localized flooding in the middle of the street, or you see a pond that is overgrown with vegetation and you're not exactly sure what it's intended to do. So that was that initial problem area list that kind of started the process. Then we went through those technical analyses. So the city has a citywide hydrologic and hydraulic model that we updated with updated land use and impervious percentages. So we have a more realistic perspective of rainfall and runoff, and then capacity deficiencies. So some of those project opportunities were identified based on, oh, well, our model is showing some flooding in this location. This pipe appears to be undersized. Similarly, the stream assessment identified maybe eroding banks, culvert failures, things like that, that ultimately funneled into that larger opportunity list.
Isn't maintenance also, I mean, I find that confusing, the maintenance of some of those sites. I help out on one of the boards of our HOA, and it was surprising to learn that it was the HOA's responsibility for maintenance. And for 15 years, we haven't done any maintenance on it. It's thankfully functioning, but
What HOA is that?
Not the same one as mine, which had the same issue.
and this is a broader comment and probably not directed just towards you, but obviously maintenance is key. We all just assume we have these facilities, and since we are not having water back up in our homes, everything's okay. But I find it's important for us all to recognize who has responsibility for maintenance so that these function on these big storms. So I guess it's just a comment. I think there's additional education that's needed so that the whole system works as planned.
Right. Well, that's a great example. One of the programs that we have identified is a facility maintenance program, because right now the city has responsibility for public systems, but those private systems are typically the ones that public works staff get called out on. And in cases where they were installed more recently, there are agreements in place that warrant who's responsible and what to do. But that program that we've established recognizes that there are some facilities where maybe ownership is a little undefined or that agreement isn't fully in place. And it provides some funding so that public works staff can go out and do the deferred maintenance.
Yeah, funding was key because we have not prepared, we've not put money aside for the upkeep. So anyways, thank you.
Commissioner Heberlein?
Great. Can you go back to the staffing slide?
Sure.
Sorry, the next one.
The programs?
No, the one farther down where you had the slide next after this one.
Oh,
Not
sure.
before. Yeah. So you've got staffing defined for the near term, midterm, and long term, but not for the annual. Was that assumed that's included as part of the current staffing to support that 2.54 million annually, or is there a plan to identify what staffing needs are required for those?
Right. The staffing needs can, shift a little bit, especially on the community development and engineering in accordance with the schedule for when those capital projects go in. The staffing needs, the more immediate staffing needs, particularly for public works, is associated, and the thought is they would be hired and then they would be kind of that cost over time, right? So we need to add an additional staff person within this time frame. That's really why they were kind of called out in that way. But the public works maintenance staff, that was to respond to some of those deferred maintenance activities. We had went through a detailed process with the maintenance supervisor and looked at where they have to borrow resources in order to do the commitments that are outlined in your permit and in your stormwater management plan. So that kind of deferred maintenance and the staffing needs there was identified in the nearer term as a nearer term need. Right now, they're able to kind of beg, borrow, and steal to get their permit requirements met, but to be able to proactively do that.
What I'm trying to figure out is you've got a program cost annually of 2.54 million. There is some component of that is city labor.
Yeah, so
Is that staffed currently?
the majority of the program cost is that Charbonneau consolidated plan, which we're already implementing and when that program went into place, we did add a staff person at that time to help with that program. So that's probably why you don't see any staffing need under the program.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. And then one comment on the citywide planning project, City 3, for the porous pavement pilot study. So there's no previous studies out there or other data that shows the effectiveness of porous pavement?
Actually, there are a number of studies that are evolving. Most recently, the city of Milwaukee and city of Gresham participate in a similar pilot study looking at the effectiveness of a porous pavement overlay. The city right now, and Zach could probably speak to this more than I can, but doesn't readily use porous pavement within the city. And so looking at how does it work given traffic and neighborhood kind of needs.
Yeah, I can add on that, previous porous pavements, you've probably seen the porous concrete sidewalks that we have along Beckman and Twos, and they're very, that iteration of porous pavement was very labor intensive. You can see that, it looks like a green carpet in places because it's so labor intensive. A lot of the information we're seeing from these pilot programs that Milwaukee and Gresham have been doing are really promising and could help us not have to do so many, it could help us improve water quality without having to add a bunch of the water quality facilities. So really a big benefit to already developed areas. What we want to do is have a chance to look at those the results of those projects, coordinate with those agencies, and then do, depending on that outcome, do one of our own pilot studies and do our own before we start implementing that, citywide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, that works. Thank you.
Commissioner Semenova?
Thank you. Because I'm a newbie, where would the funding for these projects and programs come? Is there like money that's set aside already that has been collected, or is this going to be a new fund that needs to get funded?
So following the adoption of the Stormwater Master Plan, we'll go into fee and rate analysis. So right now, projects are funded a portion through your utility bill. You have a stormwater utility fee on your bill. So we'll review and see if there's any need to adjust that amount. And then there's also the two primary ways we fund projects are through that utility fee and through what's called a stormwater system development charge. And that's a one-time fee that's paid by development that pays for the oversizing of projects that's needed to accommodate their development in the city system. I know it's a little wonky, but.
So each one of those would have its own proposed way to fund it. And that's for projects and programs.
And each project has a percentage that shows how much is attributed to growth and how much is existing, serves existing residents.
And that's to come, or is that in the, I haven't read the 434-page report yet. I did skim over it. It's fantastic.
So the fee study is a separate process after the plan is adopted. Yeah.
Okay. And within this report, are the risks and alternatives also identified if we wanted to see that, or is that something that you would present?
So for some of the projects, we did look at various alternatives or changes that could be accommodated and selected kind of the preferred alternative, which is what we costed and prepared fact sheets and that kind of conceptual design information for.
And it's within this report if I want to see it. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
To carry on from your question, though, to clarification, many of these projects are already underway, is my understanding. Some of them are already underway.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, probably, they aren't in construction yet. So they haven't fully been designed or constructed. The Charbonneau program in particular. That one, there are certain pipe segments and areas that have been already done, and that was not accounted. So that was taken out of the scope and scale of the
Okay.
project.
Okay, so what's left is not started?
Right.
Okay. My last question is really kind of silly. What's the difference between hydrologic and hydraulic? I Googled it, and it wasn't helpful.
So I think of hydrologic as the rainfall hitting the surface, right? It's sort
Okay.
of the rainfall and runoff component. Then now the hydraulic part is what happens to it. So does it go into a channel? Does it go
Okay.
into a pipe? So it's looking at that component of the model, and then the hydrologic component of the model. Where do you get your rainfall? Where do you get the runoff? What impervious do you have to generate the runoff? And then the hydraulic is, what is the system?
Okay, that's actually helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, better, much better at Google. Comments are, first of all, I appreciate the effort that went into this. I think the process was applied very well. I like the fact that you were able to combine together the needs of our permits with the needs of the deficiencies to try to come up with a reduced or a combined list of projects. I think that was good. There were some leftovers from the 2012 Stormwater Master Plan. Did those, when you were prioritizing, did those take any preference over others, or was it just looked at from an overall deficiency perspective?
Those were definitely considered. We did go through the list of the 2012 CIPs. Some of them had already been constructed. Some of them were like, well, we could maybe roll that into another program or something else. One example is the Gesellschaft system. So that was a project need in 2012's master plan. We relooked at that. We actually identified a different alignment for that project, but the concept was maintained, recognizing it was still a need. And so when we went through all those project opportunities, some of those were old 2012 projects. Some of the capacity deficiencies when we remodeled weren't necessarily capacity deficiency, and then we questioned that with city staff. Have you noted flooding? Has there been any issues? Okay, and it's a way to validate the work, so.
And then the Charbonneau is a program, so it's ongoing annual cost. How long are we anticipating that annual cost to continue?
Yeah, so that project's been underway, well, it was adopted in 2014. We are in the 5th phase right now, so we are a little bit behind, but it is a 30-year plan.
30-year, okay.
And it does include replacing the entire storm system in Charbonneau.
Bit by bit.
Yep.
Did we learn anything?
Oh, yes, we've learned a lot.
Don't wait too long.
Yes.
Is that the cause? Is that it just lack of maintenance for such a
No,
large
it's
30-year program?
I have given hour-long presentations
Okay.
on Charbonneau. It's a very interesting and strange place when it was developed. It's largely due to the materials that were chosen for pipelines. A lot of metal, corrugated steel pipeline was used, and that only has a 25 to 30 year life expectancy. So a lot of the storm pipes, we've made a lot of headway on the worst of the pipelines in Charbonneau, but a lot of the pipelines, there is no bottom. The water is literally running on bare dirt. So, yeah, so that's why we have updated construction standards where we specify the exact type of pipe and pipe material and strength and all of that information when we do construction projects now.
So yes, we learned our lesson. Okay, any other comments?
Nope.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And that takes us to the next item on the agenda, which is the Frog Pond East and South Implementation Development Code. Staff, please present.
Thank you, Dan Pauly, Planning Manager. As Chair Carr read the script about certain projects being detailed at the beginning, this project came to mind. So appreciate your continued patience and perseverance as we work through this. I think tonight's presentation will hopefully help bring a lot of things together that we've been working on and kind of seeing how it's all functioning together. So give me one moment to get the presentation up here.
As Mr. Pauly does that, I would just like to remind all of you that there are Valentine's treats in the back of the room that we got from Lux Sucre, so they're tasty. So just reminding you so that you can enjoy something while we're gathered here this evening working on these items.
Because this may not otherwise be enjoyable, so. Okay. A moment, but really tonight's agenda, I want to talk about the demonstration plan that we've had prepared, the background, what's happened before you actually saw it in your packet, and what it shows. Also want to acknowledge that yesterday evening you got in your inbox a wonderful 9-page memo that gives some more detail. And so I'll be sure to include as appropriate information from that memo as we work through this today as well. Something that was in that memo that I also want to follow up with you on tonight is some of the housing variety standards, particularly going back the small unit threshold and how we've arrived at what we're recommending there, and also the mobility friendly standards, which we talked about quite a bit in our last work session. So let's get into the demonstration plan. So really, why did we do the demonstration plan? Really, the intent was to ensure, again, that all these standards are working together, since a number of them are novel, a different approach. We've talked about before why we're doing a different approach, which changes the statewide policy and a number of other reasons. And where there's not a lot of precedent, we wanted to do the best we can to ensure that what we're drafting would result in developable plans with buildable lots, and with all the variety of housing that we're aiming for, that's consistent with what's been set forth to implement from the master plan. Do want to acknowledge there's a number of prior iterations that the commission has not seen as we continue to test and develop different codes and concepts and ideas. Also, I want to note that this is one solution, one possible layout. Is not necessarily even a preferred layout or anything. There's a lot of different possibilities, and developers will all bring their own ideas, preferences, and experience when we actually do development review. So what you find then in the demonstration plan as you go through it, the consultants, Walker Macy, have some maps that just show by tax lot and subdistrict what are the actual draft standards, requirements for minimum number of units, middle housing units, small units, and mobility ready. Then there's the actual map that shows an example layout. And finally, there's tables showing the variety standards and the math to demonstrate compliance with the variety standards. Beyond the code, just want to be clear, because we had to make some assumptions as we did this, since there are a lot of choose your own adventure type things in this code, we had to kind of, what assumptions would kind of test the code the best, or answer questions, kind of reasonable worst case scenario type things. One of those is really looking at the low end of density, because the assumption with that is that'd be the hardest to meet the variety standards, because as you up the density, there's more, essentially there's more options in housing types with denser product than less dense products. So that was one of the assumptions. And also playing into infrastructure funding we're doing, looking at a low end of units, make sure that some of the infrastructure funding works. And we wanted that to be an input in some of that work as well. Besides that, you know, the variety and design standards are as drafted in the master plan. All the parks, open space, streets, and connectivity were as shown in the master plan are assumed. As you may recall, due to state rules, there's actually not any parking required out here. So, but we didn't model no parking. We worked on, you know, what would be required, or what kind of using the current minimum standards as kind of close to maybe what the market may tend to do. Just to test site planning, if we are putting parking in there, or someone chooses to be parking, what issues may arise. And building on that, we also wanted to make sure it was good site planning. We didn't want, for example, townhouses in the middle of a multifamily parking lot or something, or just those awkward kind of site planning scenarios that didn't work well, where you're trying to put different depths of lots on one block and things like that. With that all said, let's get into some of the key components, starting with a big one, housing variety. And there's a lot on this just to look at as I kind of step through some notes on what we saw in the demonstration plan. And again, really, we're looking at a wide variety of housing types spread by subdistrict and development areas in a so variety throughout is the term that we keep using. So here's some key, I would say, findings. So we did each of the subdistricts as laid out have at least 3, and many of them 4 different unit types. An example would be subdistrict E4, where you have the walk-up apartments, the elevator-served mixed-use apartments, townhouses, and detached single-family, as well as ADUs, all in that subdistrict. Also saw that unit types were able to be laid out where they're not segregated, but are in proximity to other unit types. One thing that the master plan talked about is variety on a block level. Early in the drafting of the standards, we decided it wasn't really necessary to actually say that, you know, every third house has to be a different unit type or something like that. So taking that out, one key finding I think we found is even without that, we are getting either variety on each block or variety on the adjacent block. So you're not going multiple blocks with just one unit type. E5 is an example you'll see here in the middle of this slide, where you have townhouses in 80 and detached homes on one block, but then the next block over also has multifamily. So you're seeing quite a variety there. you see the variety throughout, including some of those smaller units we're trying to push. You see, including the ADUs, you'll see cottages integrated along the BPA corridor and adjacent to townhouses and detached single family. One thing, again, a reason that we chose to model something that would tend to have a lot of detached homes is to see how easy or what it would be to meet that 60% maximum of one unit type. And as this laid out, you do have, there aren't any that exceed more than 60% of units, with many sub-districts having 50% or less of detached homes, including sub-district E6, which includes some of the urban form type 3, is right at 59% single-family detached homes. One other finding is that the standards as drafted are effective at scaling for either a small property or property spanning multiple sub-districts. Example of this can be seen here in sub-district E4. There's a small tax lot right there along Stafford. It shows how you could put, if it wasn't developed with the larger neighboring properties, you could put townhouses on there and have the alley access it from the adjacent property, or it could easily be integrated into the larger property. So we were pleased that as we looked at this, that there is that flexibility that we planned on. So I'll leave, there's a lot more in the memo, and happy to take any comments you have here in a bit, but one outstanding clarification I did is this idea of calling it credits from neighboring sub-districts may be appropriate to meet different variety standards. So essentially how this would work is where one sub-district has an excess and a portion or a neighboring sub-district doesn't have enough, as long as it's right on that border, then, you can kind of blur that line a bit, if you will. While no formal recommendations have been made yet, we're still testing and just seeing where it's appropriate, because we are very sensitive to this, because we don't want to water down the variety standards inadvertently, where we end up with less variety than we're really aiming for. But we're seeing allowing credits for mobility-friendly units makes sense, as a variety of unit types can meet the need and the flexibility. And it's in a sense not as locational dependent as some of the other variety standards. And as stated in the memo, we're generally not as supportive of credits for other variety requirements. However, we're seeing some potential merit for allowing these credits where you're having smaller portions or less than an entire sub-district joined with an entire sub-district, where it's just a question of putting it on the other side of the street. An example I put on this slide is you see sub-district in Frog Pond South, sub-district S3 and S2 just kind of line up right at a property line. So if a developer happened to get two properties, one each on each side of that property line, doesn't make sense to give them a bit of flexibility of just to allow better site planning to putting some of their required middle housing on one side of the sub-district line than another. So I will leave variety standards. I'm going to go ahead and go through all of these, and we can come back with comments, so take notes as necessary, but I think being conscious of time, I think it'll work better tonight if I just go through these. Urban form, moving on to urban form types, which really what the master plan says is directs is to create development standards for lots and structures that regulate built form according to the mapped urban form types 1, 2, and 3. Really, having urban form 1 is the most compact housing, with urban forms 2 and 3 feathering out from there. Some things we're seeing is some of the feathering out of massing is not particularly pronounced due to geometry, access, and utility considerations, resulting, for example, in 2-story detached homes in urban form 1 and larger multifamily townhouse buildings prominent in urban forms 2 and 3. And so example of this is in subdistrict E6, which you see on this slide, due to some topography, which necessitates a sewer pump station. It really makes sense from an economic standpoint to build and a number of in site design to put multifamily or similar condos, some sort of shared ownership on the far eastern edge of E6. So that's really helped us think, okay, then how can we make that work in that transect where really that's right on the edge. We are seeing that the allowed building widths and setbacks are realistic and can be met, and will end up probably more than height being the key components of differentiating between urban forms. Example is E3, where you see townhouses along the SROZ, kind of in the middle of the slide here, can have additional setbacks and less width than other townhouses that are in the middle of E3 that are urban form 2, and that allows them to be narrower buildings and set back more from the street. So I wanted to circle back again on in terms of things, outstanding clarifications, really looking at the height, particularly for urban form 3. And it's a balance of, we don't want to inadvertently discourage needed housing that would make sense in these different urban forms. So for that reason, we don't suggest actually requiring 2-story, only limiting it to 2 stories in urban form 3, but we may need to look at standards such as additional setback for 3-story buildings, just to make sure that that look and feel of kind of a 2-story, what's primarily probably a 2-story with some 1-story area, maintains that look and feel. We included in the site planning a look at the laying out both the buildings as well as the supporting parking for the Brisbane Main Street. What kind of the key takeaways is the area is available and feasible to build that type of development. There are site planning challenges with the roundabout as well as the amount of parking that a developer may want to put in this area and how that interfaces with other development nearby. So, in this demonstration plan, I think the layout shows a good solution of providing kind of a linear green. So like the townhouses to the north aren't facing straight onto the parking. But if there's additional parking or there ends up not being space for those linear greens, the use of the credits that I discussed previously could be an appropriate solution in this area as well. Parks and open space, I'll go through this pretty quick. Everything's shown as per the master plan, including that BPA, a lot of thought into that, how particularly the park, the neighborhood park interacts with the BPA easement. It is showing where some trees can be retained. Just the location kind of in the center of E1 does make retaining some of those trees in E1, which we haven't done, could be challenging. We've looked also in previous iterations at cottages, but kind of looked here at worst case scenarios, like if you try to actually lay out detached homes and townhouses, how could those work around, to what extent could those work around these trees? They've tried to put a green focal point, but still it's difficult to keep all the trees, but there could be a solution to put cottages and around that could retain more of those trees. Also, each area includes the green focal point, so you're never that far or having direct access to a green gathering spot. And streets and connectivity, it's the last thing I'll focus on. This is shown as per the master plan. Something I'd point out is there is really emphasis in the master plan and remains in here of not having long blocks, of being able to have a rich connectivity for bikes and pedestrians. So there is a balance of providing that connectivity without, that does obviously consume land, which takes land away from development area, but that's consistent with standards in other areas of the code, of town and of the code. And we think it's a reasonable balance that without it, you wouldn't have that connectivity that's really consistent with the master plan. So that is what I have on the demonstration plan. Before the follow-up, I think it'd probably be a good spot to pause. Do want to, if we can keep it concise enough that we still do have time to visit those variety standards updates, that'd be great. But happy to take any comments or questions about the demonstration plan and kind of what that means for the standards that we're drafting and looking to be adopting in the coming months.
Go ahead.
Dan, so just so I understand this, you develop the standards and then you hire a consultant to demonstrate if this works. Do I have that right?
Correct.
And their objective is it buildable? And do they reach a conclusion? I mean, it looks like there's maps that have been produced. Are they saying yes, in some form it is? Is that what the city is also?
Right, so really I think the key, where you see the key findings are in the tables, where you see the numbers run that yes, we're providing all the variety, and we used reasonably sized lots that are either based on what's common in the market or based on precedents elsewhere in Wilsonville.
So the conclusion is yes, it does work.
Correct.
At our last meeting, a developer brought up the concerns that, okay, it might be buildable, but I'm not sure. They expressed concern that they couldn't necessarily sell it, or it was not economically advantageous. Does this demonstration project take into account any of those issues? Do they work with developers on comments about the assessment?
We've done some preliminary work on this, and there's kind of two ways to approach this. You can see we've tested, are there other new urban areas that have been built in the metro area that have similar mix, particularly of the middle housing, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one way. That comparison is one way to look at that. The other way is to actually do a more like finite like market study, and really that comparison, preliminary stuff, I mean, it doesn't look like we're too far off. And we're also working at the same time as, you know, we're working with development partners on their specific land to look, you know, what does this work? What are the products and things that we're really hearing to keep in mind and that we've integrated into the code is make sure that, you know, there's a balance of not requiring too many products at too finite. Otherwise, you know, there's economies of scale there, but still we need different types of housing. It can't all be one product type. So the short answer is we haven't done a complete analysis of that at this point, but there's no red flags that are coming up that it wouldn't work. Okay. And there is this type of variety in other modern developments.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I would add to that, there's going to be other kind of bigger picture discussion items as well, including infrastructure, and we're still working through an infrastructure funding plan, which is obviously tied to financial feasibility. So there are potentially additional questions around financial feasibility from a developer's perspective that could change based on how large of a project they might have and how many improvements will be required and what their share is. But so this wasn't a full like return on investment financial feasibility analysis. Many of those things are just changing at such a quick pace that it would have been difficult to do, especially with the number of iterations that we did. But part of this was really just to understand we're not zoning in the same way we have as a city. And so there were a lot of discussions around this table, and I heard comments and questions from Planning Commission that I'm not sure we felt 100% sure about and that we thought were okay, but we didn't actually lay it on a map to make sure that it like physically was possible. Okay. So like part of this was a physical analysis to see when you have these different layers of code requirements, are they working? And then are they actually developing layouts that are consistent with what the Planning Commission envisioned? Like that's one of the questions here is, could we actually use typical lots of the different housing types and lay them out in a way that's consistent with the code, or would we run into problems? And I think we ran into a few problems along the way, and we made suggestions to you and mentioned in prior work sessions about different code elements that we may not need, like minimum lot size. So there were different kind of elements when we went through this process that we thought, well, that's kind of it's either redundant or it's not necessary or it conflicts. And it's refined some of our suggestions or thoughts that we have brought back to you or that we are currently bringing back to you. But the layouts themselves work, and I think that is an important key aspect for us to understand as we codify this area.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Heberlein, Commissioner Heberlein, sorry.
Mr. Whatever. I can take worse. Yeah, Mr. Polly, thank you for this. Visuals are super helpful. And so this, being able to get an overall east and south picture and looking at the feasibility of the code as currently proposed is really beneficial to being able to understand whether it makes sense, both from a code perspective, but just from a visual perspective, you know, seeing an option of what is possible. So this is really helpful. I'm excited to see it and continue to digest it here as we go. So thank you.
Commissioner Sebanova.
My question was more about the parking and then also the spaces designated for, like in regards to demographics that are expected to live here. I'm assuming a lot of families, in the spaces designated for children, like playgrounds, fields, courts, things like that. It's hard for me to tell, like from this, whether there will be enough parking for how many people are expected to live in these households, and the typical, you know, ownership of vehicles that people have, and then also the spaces designated for without having to drive somewhere to allow children to live in these neighborhoods.
Sure. So on the first question, again, in this demonstration plan we took, though no parking is required, what kind of a reasonable approach of what a market would provide because of market demand, that people probably aren't going to choose to buy. First choice of a house isn't something they're going to have to walk a few blocks from their car to. So, I mean, that was put in there. And by nature, I mean, it's always a balance because this is ultimately about housing people, not their cars. But we've taken a reasonable approach to make sure that if developers choose to provide parking, which generally what I've heard from them, the market is leading them to do still, is that the code works to facilitate that. There's not anything in the code that prevents them from doing so. In terms of playgrounds, so there's two components. There's a neighborhood park as well as a community park within the master plan area, which would have playgrounds and trails and typical amenities of a larger park. But beyond that, there are these green focal points that you'll see throughout, which many of those would have tot lots or small spaces, and those are really put where they are kind of a sub-neighborhood gathering spot where you can get together, and similar to what you see a lot around Vilwall, where there's smaller parks with a small play area that you can gather as a neighborhood group or easily walk to. So you can easily access green space from wherever you are in the neighborhood.
Without having to drive, okay. Thank you. It's hard to tell sometimes from
Yeah.
these kind of plans. So in the parking, the streets, I know that's not required, but the streets will allow for street parking, like,
Yeah, I mean, generally, most of it, because that's also knowing that from efficient use of land, that sometimes it's more efficient to provide the street parking than use up a bunch of buildable lot area for parking. But there'll be some of each. But even when we've looked at things like stormwater standards and where we're putting storm planters, making sure that we're accommodating for on-street parking as we plan that type of feature as well.
Thank you.
Commissioner Willard.
I know budgets have to be taken into consideration when you do these demonstration plans, but did you guys look at maximum density instead of minimum densities? Or
We
do you
didn't,
expect it to
because it really
materially change?
was a budget, and kind of what the code standards that we thought would be stretched, and again, what type of development would stretch them the most. Again, I think the key factor there is when you get into the higher density housing, there's a lot of different options. So it's going to be easier to meet the variety standards at a higher density than it would be at a low density. So that's kind of, when you have limited budget, you're looking at, what's kind of the worst case scenario that would really test and stretch that standard. And that's why we chose the approach that we did.
We did have one alternative that was, I think, more like moderate density.
Yeah.
So looking at if somebody was looking at doing a higher portion of middle housing or kind of pushing additional multifamily, what that would look like. And so we did have a demonstration plan early on that did that. We didn't kind of flesh out all the details about transportation, but we felt like, oh, okay, it's obvious that both of these scenarios could work very well. It became a question of us actually pushing kind of the envelope on the lower density to see. Part of that was to kind of test that maximum net area that goes to any one unit type and other things of that nature. If you have a lot more single family, if you're doing more of that low density, you have less space for all the other stuff. And so that's why we spent more time on this one, to just really understand how the other layers of the code worked with that.
Okay. I think I'll have more questions later.
Understood.
I would like to just say, I agree with Commissioner Heberlein. Seeing it is believing, right? We put all these words onto paper, and then it's like turning it into a picture. That definitely helps. I like your approach to taking the low density and saying, okay, well, if somebody builds the least amount, how will we apply the rest of the code, and will it work? Obviously, that's not what we're hoping for, but that way at least we know the code can handle if they do go that direction.
If I may, Chair Carr, I hate to interrupt, but I would just add that I think that it also helps you to understand what the minimum is calling for. Sure. So like part of this exercise was a practical one for us and for you to answer the questions you had. But I think the other piece of this that we welcome is like now seeing an example, does it resonate with the input you provided previously? And so if we got the minimum, how does that look? Like, does that variety still look pretty good? Like, are we hitting that mark? And how does that resonate with you in terms of these policies that if everybody who developed in this area came in and did the minimum, and this is obviously just an example, it's not gonna be exactly how it plays out, but are all the pieces fitting together with you in the way that you envisioned?
Like we saw how we probably don't need the minimum lot size, right? Because it became redundant. And why add that redundancy? So you've got some outstanding items. I'm assuming those will come back as work sessions in the future.
I think we're at a point where we're going to start keep looking at kind of the overall thing as we wrap this up. And so as you continue to think about it and have questions about how it overall works together, and really, is what was written down to implement in the master plan, is that what we're getting here? Even as Ms. Batesville says, at kind of worst case scenario, lowest density. Because the lowest density is not that low of density still, right? Because we do have that minimum of 1,325 units. You're still, by nature, even that minimum, you're pushing getting a variety of units.
And then the last one I had is the credits. The credits are curious to me. I kind of like those. I like the idea behind it. But and we have to obviously dig into it more, but how is that going to work if the adjacent lots are developed at different times? That's one of
This would only work if, like, essentially you have a development area
is crossing it.
That's crossing it. So it wouldn't be like a future credit. It's like you come in to DRB with your stage 1 master plan, and it goes across multiple sub-districts.
Okay, right. Okay.
Which, if I go back to
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, just a couple adders. I think, looking at the questions that you had for the Planning Commission, initial input or questions on the clarifications, I don't think I have anything. Does this resonate? Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I think it generally looks good. There wasn't anything when looking at the pictures that jumped out as being like, oh, this is a huge issue, or it looks, it doesn't look like it would feel like a good neighborhood. Having a summary, maybe of the overall east and south of here's the different housing types, just as an easier way to see kind of overall what the overall neighborhoods look like, would be helpful. It was nice to see the minimum requirements listed in the zones. But then being able to just get a summary of, okay, here is what this would look like overall, so that we can easily say, oh, this is how many mobility ready units are available, would help give a little better, just kind of a, looking at it overall, does it make sense? Yeah. And then parking, just to follow up on Commissioner Semenova, so do you have an idea of the number of parking spaces that would be available in a plan like this in comparison to the number of homes that would be available?
I don't have a full analysis on this. Maybe it'd be analysis on a smaller area we could do of, what percent of the townhouses, for example, have driveways.
Yeah.
And generally, all the townhouses will have garages. And obviously, if there's not an alternative of where to park your car, people will tend to use the garage more than if there is ample street parking or a driveway, right? As I think of my 3-car garage with no cars in it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the general preference is to use the garage for something other than parking.
Yeah, but by nature, if there really is not a good alternative, you're going to use your garage.
Yeah.
Be more apt to use your garage. And that is a parking space. So I don't think we can discount that as assume it's not a parking space, because it can be. I don't have analysis of the parking. We've kind of more focused on like the mixed use area and how that parking's working. Because generally our experience, if it's primarily townhouses or detached homes in Wilsonville, even like in Villebois, which is in some areas pretty dense with those, is it generally works. And in Wilsonville's experience is really where that interface with multifamily has been the areas that where that generates parking complaints.
Yeah, and I guess, the kind of my rationale for the question is, if you were saying, okay, in general for the middle housing and single family, not, multifamily apartments, there is typically one parking space per house, then that's one thing. If it was 3/4 of a parking space, then I think we would start seeing an issue where we would have more parking issues in areas where we don't see it currently or at the same magnitude. So
I think generally each of these townhouses, duplexes, or detached homes have a garage, and generally probably have either a street parking space or a driveway apron.
Okay.
So, and that is how we'd expect it at this point, and what we've heard from the development community, what, market preferences are, what they'd still do. Long-term, and we'll talk about this in the coming months, is we have to think about strategies of how we address it when there's not enough parking, because we will, over time, come to those scenarios. And that comes into other strategies and other programs. And so that's a topic for another day. But as this is laying out, and what we're hearing from our development partners now, they're not looking at building housing that a large area without sufficient parking.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Okay.
Okay, I think we can still be on track to get out of here by 8. I think we're doing good tonight. That was, threshold for small units. So for those of you that have been on, this is a question. So one of the key variety requirements is that you have a certain percentage of, quote, small units to provide a more attainable, both that's something that can be less expensive, still expensive, but less expensive, but also provides some options for smaller households. So the original draft you saw early last year, that seems like forever ago now, was 1,200 square feet. And the feedback where it said, why is it 1,200 square feet? Let's really look at that and kind of think through that. Is that the right threshold? So we have done that. The current proposal is 1,500 square feet. I go into more explanation of where that math comes from in the memo. For those of you that read that, I hope you enjoyed that reading. But in short summary, really that represents the 60%, which I'm finding more and more as we write these, that is 60% is a nice number because it's that half, and usually that half is a good break point, but also it adds 10% of wiggle room, right? Which functions the same, but brings fewer conflicts in the future. But so that's kind of where we looked at the nationwide average lot size, kind of what the recent home square footage, as well as recent in Wilsonville, so it ends up cutting that in half, or going 60% of that number, you get to 1,500. So it's like, okay, that's starting to feel okay. That might be a reasonable threshold. And then did some testing of that, really looking at what is for sale, what does the market look like? Never on this stuff do you have perfect data, but try to find the best data we could to look at what is a good proxy to kind of just test this to see if it's like within the ballpark of reasonable. So we looked at current units for sale. Wilsonville seemed like too small of a sample size, so decided to look Clackamas County-wide. As those of you that may be familiar with the gradual growth of both car size and house size over the years. Further back you go, smaller the houses are. And also the manufactured homes represent, and I mean, we talk about that in our housing as throughout the state, manufactured homes are an important part of the housing market to provide affordable options. But we're not anticipating a lot of mobile home parks. I mean, there's nothing that prohibits it out here, but we're not anticipating that being a primary development type out here. So kind of took those out of the mix, looked at what amount of 1,500 square foot units or less are available currently listed in Clackamas County. And we found 6.2% if you look since 1990, and then as you move forward, get more modern, that gets less and less, right? If you went back to 1980, it'd be bigger, 1970 or 60, I mean, it becomes a bigger percentage. So what that said to me is like, okay, 5%, requiring 5% at 1,500, that seems like that a good spot to be, because it pushes, kind of keeps that trend of being at least 5%. It's within the ballpark. It is pushing the development community to provide this needing housing without being too aggressive. Something else I looked at in this analysis is where are those big jumps? As you step up by like 250 square feet, where are those big jumps that take up a big chunk of, if you look at like a bar graph of what area are the biggest chunks of the housing market, really you do see a huge jump between 1,500 and 1,750. You start to see a pretty significant jump. So that was also a signal to me that that seemed like a reasonable threshold, that once you get over 1,500, you're getting into what's generally developed, what you'd imagine detached single family home, but 1,500. So that, as I looked at it, these different angles, more and more I felt comfortable recommending 1,500 as a good threshold there. And so some of you I imagine have read that, so any comments or questions on that threshold? Are we comfortable with this as the threshold, or is there any more information be helpful for the commission in arriving at this as a recommendation?
Commissioner Constantine.
I don't have comments.
Commissioner Heberlein.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to think in my head whether or not putting it at 1,500 makes sense, or if it's too big. And, you know, what's the goal we're really trying to accomplish? And one of the ways, I think, to get more affordable housing is to have smaller units. And so by defining a small unit as something larger, if that's where things are going to bump up against, then you may have more expensive housing than if you went to a smaller amount. So I'm trying to figure out in my head whether or not 1,500 makes sense in comparison to 1,200. It would be, it might be interesting to see what a proposed theoretical cost based on STCs and all of that stuff, a 1,200 square foot home would be in comparison to a 1,500, just to get a general
and I think
feel.
from a practical standpoint, this may be helpful to the commission, is we know that because of other requirements that you're like, that how ADUs and cottages work, particularly ADUs, that you're going to see a number of ADUs and which are well below that 1,500, right? Those are, 800 square foot units. So you're going to get that chunk of the requirement, but if you put it too low, then no one's going to build that 1,200 to 1,500 square foot unit. So there's that kind of component of it too, is you're going to already get those smaller ADU units. And really, in the end, what I've seen, what I'd guess would end up meeting these requirements. You're going to see quite a few as ADUs, which we're encouraging ADUs from a number of fronts. And so we're really hoping, I think we will see ADUs out here at a higher rate than we've seen elsewhere in the city. You're going to see some of these met by multifamily units, which are more affordable, so which are around that kind of 1,000 to 1,500 size oftentimes, which do create, particularly the elevator serve, those accessible smaller units. You'll also see, to the extent cottages would also meet those, and those cottages by definition are going to be well below 1,200. So thinking about what type of units, that these aren't primarily probably going to be just detached homes somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500, that allowing that flexibility will actually probably bring more variety onto the market than you'd get if you set the threshold like at 1,000.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Sabanova.
Coming back to that, I'm trying to understand the why behind it.
The why behind having small units?
Yeah. What is the why behind it?
So it's something that, going back to the master plan, is we looked, part of that was an affordable housing analysis, and that there was a need for these smaller units that we really identified through the master planning process, target unit types that we wanted to require to make sure that they were actually built, that otherwise may be underdeveloped or not built, underbuilt or not built in by the market. And so those were middle housing, as well as these small units. So that's really where that comes from, is something that was identified through the master plan, particularly the affordable housing portion of the master plan, as a unit that we need to be proactive in actually requiring to make sure it is built and meets a housing need in the community.
Yeah, I understand why we need the small units, but the square footage change, of the 300 square feet, is it to make it more attractive to the market, or?
More realistic or more consistent with the market? As I recall the conversation when we first looked at the 1,200, is like, okay, are we missing, is a 1,300 square foot unit meeting substantially the same purpose as a 1,200 square foot unit? And something we saw looking at this data is if you put it down to 1,250, that's only representing like 2.5% of the current market. So that is quite a ways more off. If you dial it down to like 1,200, 1,250, you are pushing the market a lot more to develop something that it's not going to naturally be looking at.
Okay.
And so that's something that we're trying to balance, being aggressive and creating good policy, but also balancing that with being not too aggressive.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Willard.
No, I trust your judgment on this one. I think the 1,500 makes sense with what you've described.
Okay.
I agree. I like the analysis. I like the comparison to Clackamas County. I think you're right. Just looking at Wilsonville probably wasn't a fair enough comparison. But I think the current requirement's 10%, isn't it? 10%, and that requires small units, or what's?
It's 5%.
It is 5%.
Yeah.
Okay. And that would match moving up to 1,500, would cover what is essentially currently 5% available.
Yeah. So, in a way, it's kind of holding the status quo.
Sure.
Which, that's policy choice, ultimately. But it certainly, be honest, what it does is it doesn't allow this area to further reduce the amount of...
Artificially burden a developer with small units, right?
Because we can't, I mean, it's a balance, because, right, you can't make up all of the deficit of small units throughout the community and throughout the county in this one development, right? So it's where do you strike that balance? So that is something that's a policy choice that, I mean, if it's different than what we have drafted, we're very interested in your input and your thoughts on that.
I don't know. I'm going to think about that, don't I?
Yeah. I acknowledge it.
Philosophically, I'm struggling with the idea of maintaining the status quo.
Yeah.
I mean, really.
That's why I bring it up.
And I'm glad you did. And, you know, what struck me from the table that you had in your additional data was that 71% of the homes for sale are larger than 2,000 square feet.
Yeah.
So, maybe it's not 10, maybe it's 7.5%, something that's getting us a little bit closer to providing. And I think the struggle I have is it because market demand is driving us to larger homes, or are we just catering to a segment of the market? And there is another segment of the market that is underserved that needs the smaller, therefore more affordable homes.
You know, I've mentioned before that, like, during the recession, what you saw a lot, you know, car producer producing a lot more expensive SUVs than they did small cars, because there was still market for those large SUVs. They could sell them, they can make a higher profit margin on them.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there is some market activity there that goes a certain direction.
Yeah.
So
I would be interested in looking at maybe a little more, maybe a skosh more.
So like
More than
keeping
5%.
1,500, but like, is 5% the right amount is really, yeah. Other thoughts from the commission?
Be interested to know the, I guess, price point difference between a 1,200 and a 1,500. Because again, the whole reason this came in is our affordable housing. And if you're now saying affordable housing is a 1,500 square foot, does that really fit the model for what we've classified as affordable?
Yeah, and you're probably not going to see a huge difference, particularly if you're looking at like a detached home or a condo. But it really gets into that question of what type of unit that is typically that size, does it end up qualifying to be a small unit? Particularly when you start looking at multifamily units.
Right. Okay. That would be my input for the future discussion is, okay, give us a breakdown of what those units you think they are and what do those qualify for affordable? And you're right, we can't make up all affordable housing requirements by the state in one building, in one development. But we have to move the needle that direction.
All right, we'll continue this conversation. So to follow up on another conversation in hopefully in the next 8 minutes, is following up on, we talked quite a bit about mobility-ready units in the last work session. And based on feedback and things we've heard and prior study we've done since then, there's a couple things that we'd recommend. First of all, simplify the code and the analysis by removing the partial definition, where you just have one definition mobility-ready unit, which is a unit with a kitchen, full bathroom, bedroom on a single level, and it's accessible from a parking space or public sidewalk without the use of stairs or minimum stairs or, you know, having a space for a ramp, essentially. Again, getting back to this notion of being impactful while not too aggressive. Currently, we're at 10%, half of which, 2/3 of which could be this master on main, or essentially the better way, I think, to describe it for our purposes is you have the mobility-ready unit, and it's a question of whether or not you have a portion that's accessed by stairs in addition to the mobility-ready unit. So rather than so kind of switched that around, looked a lot. It's the data on this is hard. I'm going to continue to dig for data because it's really hard to find good apples to apples comparisons, because really the data finding is either like federal subsidized housing, which is primarily multifamily. The federal minimum standard is 5%, fully accessible. Then some larger cities that are trying to be more aggressive have bumped that to 10% because they feel the federal standard is too lenient. And then other jurisdictions just look at visitability, which is something that we've discussed, and really from the policy discussion is not really what we're looking at. We're really looking at single level living is the intent of this mobility ready language. So that's not a good comparison either. So the draft right now, 10% is probably too aggressive based on what I'm seeing. So 7.5%, which keeps essentially the portion that is the single level living about the same as what we had prior discussed with the 10% requirement. It just reduces what would be required to be that master on main type unit. That so essentially that of that 7.5%, that could all be ADUs or cottages that are, or elevator served flats. Or you could say that's a single family home that you're going to put some a couple bedroom upstairs that are accessed by stairs too. So that is, and so at the bottom of the slide, you can kind of see how that looks then in the code, rather than having that longer description and the number / another number. It's just one number with then a footnote that says, you know, a third of these can have a stair access portion in addition to the mobility ready portion of the unit. So I'm going to continue to look for more data to just test 7.5% to make sure that's right, and bring that back. But just wanted your input to see if this is headed the right direction based on our prior discussion.
Cool, thanks. Okay, so I want to make sure I understand this. So for an example, you're saying that there's a requirement of 11, 12, and 14 minimum number of mobility-ready units in this picture.
Yeah.
And so for that top one, with the subnote, you're saying that only 2/3 of those 11 need to be single level, and the remaining 1/3 could have a portion of that mobility-ready unit being stair accessed. So
as long as the portion that's not accessible by stairs, standing alone would meet the definition of mobility ready.
Oh, okay, that's different than what I thought you meant.
That'd be master on the main.
Master on the main, yeah.
So as long as you have a bedroom, a kitchen, and a bathroom, all on the same level, it meets on the ground level or elevator accessed, you meet the requirement.
Right.
But adding a couple bedrooms upstairs would still meet why do we need that footnote?
The footnote is saying that only a portion of the units can have additional living spaces beyond.
Because we still want to provide some of the small single level units.
What we have heard, right, so what we heard previously was that there was a desire for units to not just all be like master on main, that there was a desire to provide unit types, whether that's in an ADU or a single family detached dwelling unit or an apartment, but like the entire unit, the entire housing type is full mobility ready, meaning you don't have any stairs.
Yeah.
We heard that as a desired like policy choice. So that's the full mobility unit. What we're essentially saying, we then heard an input from a stakeholder saying that like having the ability to do master on main or something like that, where you have portions of the unit that maybe are like for guests or whoever, but there's like the ability to build the house to 2 stories and provide that flexibility for who may live there or whatever, that would be helpful. And so what we're saying is, okay, a portion of your mobility ready units can have that. But well, the portion is a third. And so we could go to 100% one way or the other. Like we're kind of drafting this to try to respond to different viewpoints and interests and kind of say that there might be, if you have a cottage that has upstairs that has a couple extra bedrooms, but somebody could live fully on the first floor, that's still meeting that objective of providing more units on the market for people with limited mobility. And so we had a desire to say, okay, sure, because we don't, if you say 100% of them have to be full mobility, and you're essentially then saying for a single family detached that has to be 1 story, that might be difficult to obtain in current market.
Yeah.
And so it kind of gets at different housing types, right? Like a full mobility, like in an apartment, you're not going to have this issue because your unit, especially if you're in an elevator served, is going to be full mobility ready. So if we're trying to, part of this is like trying to have a diversity of housing types, a variety of housing types in general, but also for everybody. So the desire that we heard was that not all of the mobility-ready units should be apartments, because and so we want to try to increase mobility-ready units in different housing types. And so it's hard to get a single-level, single-family home nowadays and to have those be constructed. And so this essentially, the 1/3 in some ways, allows us to potentially get mobility-ready units where the ground floor could be livable by somebody who has limited mobility, but then there's upstairs bedrooms and possibly bathroom for guests, et cetera.
I guess what I was trying to figure out is if it was worded appropriately such that as long as you had those 3 components on a single level, it doesn't matter what you have if you have a second level. You could have you could have 100% of the units have a bedroom upstairs as well, as long as it met the requirements on the ground floor.
Yes, that could be. I think that in the past, we have heard a different direction than that.
Okay.
Which is why we've wanted to ensure that we have some units that don't have those extra spaces that have stairs. Now, we're still drafting code amendments. So the Planning Commission is entitled to change their opinion. I want to make that clear, but the reason why it's there is because we have heard that along the way, is that we haven't wanted all of the units to be that way.
And I think a key question to ask is, well, just by requiring the small units, are you already going to have enough of the single level units between multifamily, ADUs, and cottages without having to add another definition or another standard? Or is it something that wouldn't happen otherwise to get those single level accessible units that you need to put additional language in there?
Because we also want to ensure that the mobility-ready units are used by somebody that has mobility constraints. And so if 100% of them had master on the main and bedrooms upstairs, a family of 4 could buy that and put the kids upstairs, right?
Yeah, but
and the person in the wheelchair doesn't have a house to buy.
But it doesn't matter what we do. We can't control who buys the home.
I understand.
We're trying to provide opportunities for it to happen, not guarantee that it will happen.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you.
Any other comments? Sorry. I'm just thinking among, do you have any comments?
But I like the idea of having some homes just be completely all, like even if it's a very small percentage like this, to be all on single level. Like that is a dream for a lot of people. Maybe even not people that have mobility issues, but yeah, just having that be an option. There's not a lot on the market that's affordable for that.
Yeah, no additional comments beyond what's been said.
Yeah, I appreciate the work and the background. I think giving us the why sometimes helps us come to terms with what we're talking about. So yeah, providing that context is always helpful. I like the fact that we're simplifying it though. Because again, if we're saying things just to say it, instead of making it more simple so that it's easier to accommodate while still reaching the goals that we're trying to. I appreciate that.
Right.
Yeah, I think my struggle is we're simplifying it in one way, but then adding the complexity somewhere else. And so what have we really achieved?
Anything else? All right.
Thank you.
Do we have public comment cards?
Oh, incoming.
This is a good question for the commission and whether you want to take public comment at this time during a work session. We have recently, but as you know, on the agenda, public comment is at the front end of the meeting, so it'd be something that the commission should discuss and agree upon.
I think, I like your comments. I think we should put that on the agenda so that anybody that is prepared to do their presentation at the front. I'd like to see that on the agenda if we're going to.
Well, the agenda right now states the public comment for any item that's not a public hearing is at the front end of your meeting. And you announced that at the beginning and asked for public input. None was received at that time. I'm sure we have, by seeing a speaker card, we have interest at this time by those in attendance to approach the commission during this work session. So we just need some type of determination by the commission that you would like to hear public comment at this time.
And I would also note that if you are going to entertain public comment at this time, since it's not on the agenda, that you also set the parameters for the public comment. So, for example, in our public comment period, we only allow comments that are 3 minutes long. But that's the commission's prerogative of what parameters you want to set.
Yes, Commissioner Heberlein.
Yeah, I guess my take is we have set a precedence that we either need to choose to continue following or go back to what the intent of the agenda was. I mean, ever since we started the Frog Pond East and South, we've had public comment during the work session. So I think we just need to decide what we want to do going forward. I think we're kind of stuck today because we haven't made a decision beforehand.
Sure.
So.
Okay, so do we want to decide in the future then to take only public comments on work session at the beginning, which is per the language of, yes.
I say we allow it tonight, and if we want to change it, we change it for future.
Okay.
And our public would probably like getting out of here early, maybe. It might be something they prefer.
Any comments, Commissioner Simone? Nope, okay. So Dan, we will listen to your public comments and then, but in the future, we'll take your public comments at the beginning.
And I have a comment on that.
Chair Carr.
But you make the rules, so I appreciate that. So,
Excuse me, Mr. Grimberg,
and
just
I
one
know
quick
I'm
section.
very limited on time.
Hold on.
Are we doing a limit of 3 minutes on this? Do I set a timer, or are we, I didn't hear a decision.
We've typically only held that for
Hearings.
contentious
Yeah.
hearings with lots of participants.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, we're not, right?
Okay.
No.
Okay. Are we ready?
Yes.
Okay. Dan Grimberg, West Hills Land Development. Appreciate your time this evening. I will make it brief and get everybody out of here. First of all, we appreciate being able to work with staff on this. This is a very complicated plan. It was mentioned that some parts of the code are simple. This is the most complicated code we've ever worked on. So just to put that in perspective, there's 3 unit types required per sub-district. There's then different varieties and different requirements by the urban form area, which is different than the sub-district, right? And then the setbacks are one item that varies by the street that the lot faces on. So you got all those components working, and it all determines how you can build a house. And the variety is very difficult to meet. And Commissioner Constantine mentioned, has there been a market study basically? And the answer, in my opinion, is no. And we're trying to make it work, even though that hasn't been done. And we know the market pretty well. We've been building in this market for 30-some years. And in Wilsonville and in the metro area, that's all we build in. We don't build across the country. We are local. So we know this market, and we know what sells. And we also know, my main comment tonight is the code needs to allow for flexibility, which this is a very prescriptive code, and I understand that there's goals, but there needs to be flexibility. This is housing that's going to be built over the next 10 to 15 years, and the market changes. We don't create a market. I mean, we do not control what the buyer wants, right? So the buyer, the homeowner, the family that's buying the home, they determine what they want in a house, and we build to that need. We don't say you're going to buy this because we think this is a good idea. That's not how it works, which is, you all know that, but sometimes we get so wrapped up in the code, and we do that ourselves because we're trying to meet the code, the draft code. We're like, did we check all the boxes? Did we get there? Do we hit the number? It's like, yeah, we hit the number, but it's like, can we sell it? That's a big question. So without getting into all the code, which we have a good relationship, we're working on every week. We have our Tuesday afternoon meeting, and we work through a lot of these issues, and we've made a lot of progress. But at some point along the line here, they're going to ask you, do you approve of this code? And my request on that is, you're giving it a lot of consideration, but please don't adopt the plan without also having other items be known, such as when is the sewer getting extended that serves the Frog Pond East and South area. Right now, you may know this, that's probably 3 years plus, we don't know. So this plan is not going to get built today, even if we want it to get built today. It can't because it doesn't have sanitary sewer. Another utility concern is the stormwater master plan. There's some part of one of the properties that and I realize we're just one property, but we are testing the code because we have a vested interest in it, that part of our property drains south of Advance Road. And there's a project on the stormwater master plan for a conveyance pipe. It was like in the 400 and some pages, our consultant has now left, but it was like $4 million. Okay, and our property needs it for a very small portion, but it happens to be kind of in the middle of the property. So how is that pipe going to get built? It's $4 million, and it says it's a high priority or whatever the classification was, so it'd be prioritized between 2024 and 2028. I don't know if that means it's funded. It says there's credits of 3.3 million. So does that mean that they expect the developer to build that and then get credits, which probably is not going to work. That's a $4 million upfront, and then you get it back so much a house. So I don't know what the plan is. But again, the point is that needs to be known before this plan is approved, because how does it all fit together? And then the other big item is on the infrastructure finance plan for the improvements of like Stafford Road, Advance Road, and then there's some roundabouts being proposed. And the scope of those improvements and the credits that are allowed against those improvements will have a huge impact on the feasibility of all of the development of Frog Pond East and South. So we're having our first powwow on that with city staff. I think it's on the 26th. And staff has told us they're not going to have the plan. Maybe that's not the right way to word it, but they're going to present certain components of the plan, and then there's a lot of work to be done. So that finance plan is huge. So, and then one other item on the stormwater, there's the stormwater management plan, which is different than the stormwater master plan. And we've done some analysis when we prepared our plan that you've seen us hand out our colored map, and I think it was part of the package you got tonight. That shows the density that's allowed under the current stormwater, not master plan, stormwater management plan. And so the new code that's being proposed will reduce the density by our consultants' analysis by 15%. And 15% on like 300 lots that we would have is 45 lots. If each lot was worth, just for ballpark figure, just for round figuring, $200,000, that's a $9 million reduction in value. It just doesn't work. So I just mentioned that because you're going to be hearing about all these items, and it all affects the plan. We're trying to make the plan work, but these other items are affecting the financial feasibility of the plan, of the development. We're trying to create value, and we need to control costs. So thank you. I probably went over my 3 minutes, but I didn't mean to.
And timing of the testimony, did you address that? Beginning of the meeting or end of the meeting?
Oh, yeah, excuse me. On the testimony, we appreciate the opportunity to speak. So I hope I didn't say anything wrong tonight. But in our opinion, it's pretty worthless for us to stand up here in the beginning of the meeting and give you our input on something you haven't even been presented. At least if you've been presented the information and we have some comments, you have a context to put those into. I just don't see that it works the other way. Our comments would be kind of like, oh, thank you, go sit down and, you're off and running. It just doesn't fit together, but that's your decision, and I appreciate you trying to get things done, so thank you.
Thank you. No other items on the agenda? Anything staff, no staff presentations, city council, nothing else?
No additional items. I will note that Mr. Weigel, the city engineer, wanted me to convey that the draft stormwater master plan is available right now for public review and comment, and it's on letstalkwilsonville.com. So that was something that he forgot to mention, and they're accepting public comment through February 26th.
Thank you. Anyone want to make a motion to close the meeting? Adjourn the meeting?
Sure, I move that we adjourn the meeting.
You want a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We're done.